This morning we are going to start with something a little bit different. So I know that you all are studying very, very hard, and there is an outside world there, though, and if you happened to turn on your TV last night, you would have found out about the drama that was happening in Congress, and which eventually played out with them not passing a resolution to continue funding the government. So this morning we have a government shutdown. And this is a prelude to the fact that the government will hit the debt ceiling in about 2 to 3 weeks. It's some uncertainty when it's going to happen, but it will happen fairly soon. And the question is, what will happen then? Well, we had this scenario back in July and August of 2011, and what happened then was that they reached this very messy last-minute compromise to raise the debt ceiling, but then they had to agree on some budget cuts. They couldn't do it in the short run, so they set up a committee, and they said, if this committee can't agree, then we're going to have these very drastic cuts on defense and on entitlements. And the idea was that the two sides would be forced to agree. The Democrats would be very upset if the entitlements were cut, and the Republicans would be very upset if the defense was cut. They didn't reach an agreement, and then we had a messy set of deadlines moving a month, 2 months. And eventually we had the sequester go into operation in March. We've now got the same point again, and the question is, what's going to happen? The president says he's not going to negotiate about this. The Republicans say, no, you've got to do various things, make various concessions, or we won't raise it. Now, in August 2011, one of the big uncertainties was what exactly is going to happen. So one of the things they said at the time was, well, we won't have the money to pay the debt, and so we'll default. And of course, if the US government was to default, that would be very problematic. So one of the big issues is, as we go through the next couple of weeks, what's going to happen? Now, at the moment, the markets are very calm. They haven't gone down much at all yet, and the assumption appears to be that, don't worry, they're going to do the deal. So yesterday, for example, yesterday morning, Merrill Lynch put out a report that there's a 30% probability of a government shutdown. So I would have said that was a little low given what was happening yesterday, and that's turned out to be the case. But now, one of the interesting questions is, how long will they shut down go? And we'll see. And I think that's a very interesting, as I say, prelude to the fight on the debt ceiling that we're going to see in 2-3 weeks' time. Now, because there was so little knowledge about what would actually happen if we get to this point where the US government can't borrow, not because of market constraints, but because of the debt ceiling, the Penn Law School and the Wharton Financial Institutions Center got together, and we had this conference to ask the question, how would things play out if we repeated the July-August 2011 scenario? What are the legal issues? What are the economic issues? And so on. Now, this is the book that we produced as a result of this. You can download it for free on the internet. If you just go to the Financial Institutions Center, you'll see this picture. You can click on it and download it. And it's a very interesting question. We have something in the US called the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and it contains what's known as the debt clause. The debt clause says that the debt of the United States government, if it's properly legally issued, shall not be questioned. And the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean we can't default, or what does it mean? So it's only been taken to the Supreme Court once, and that was in the 1930s for what's known as the Perry case. Now, if you go back before the Great Depression, it was very common to put into debt contracts the fact that you had the alternative to being paid in dollars to be paid in gold. And the idea was that if for some reason the US went off the gold standard, then its value would probably fall, and you would still have the right to have gold as your means of payment. Now, in the Great Depression, the US did go off the gold standard. The value of the dollar fell relative to other currencies. And this created a problem because if the government, which had these gold clauses in them, in their debt, and many private firms too, if they had to pay in gold, that would have made things much worse in terms of the economy because the debt burden was much higher. And we already had GDP way down, 25% unemployment. Things were already drastic. So Congress passed a law which said, forget about the gold clause. You don't have to pay in gold. We're invalidating that clause. Not surprisingly, it went to the Supreme Court, and it was a very contentious Supreme Court case. It was eventually decided 5-4. The 5 argued that Congress had the right to control the means of payment, and that the Constitution gave them that right, and therefore they had the right to pass this law. The 4 argued for the sanctity of contract, and what the argument there was, we signed a private contract, you as the government have no right to invalidate that contract. If the government can turn around and invalidate contracts, then we have no security in our economic dealings going forward because they can always invalidate it. Now, it was the pragmatic decision. It actually helped the economy significantly. If they had gone the other way, then this would have been a big problem. The Great Depression would have been even worse. On the other hand, I guess my own view would be it was a default. The bondholders had a contract with the government which said the government would pay them in gold if they wanted it. And the government then turned around and said, sorry, we're not going to do that anymore. And in my mind, that's a default. Now, it's a very interesting question, what would happen this time? There are 2 chapters, I think, which are particularly interesting in this book for the current situation. The first is by Professor Michael McConnell, who's one of the leading constitutional experts, and he's a professor at Stanford. And he goes through and explains about the 14th Amendment and the debt clause and what it probably means. And my reading of that is that it's going to be problematic for them to default because there are going to be lots of lawsuits that they've broken the 14th Amendment. This is going to be a big distraction. And so the question is, well, what's the alternative? Well, there's another nice chapter by Professor Howell Jackson, who's a professor at Harvard. And what he did was to get 2 of his JD students to go through and look back and see what are the things that people have said about this possibility over the last century or so. And they come up with all the letters from the Treasury and so on. And my reading of that is that what's likely to happen is there's something called first in, first out. What that means is the bills come in for the government, they stack them up with the first in at the top, and as the tax revenues come in, because just because you can't borrow doesn't mean there won't be tax revenue, so the government will be getting money. They take the money, they pay the bill off the top, which came in first, and they pay the second bill and so on. Since there's not going to be enough money to pay all the bills because the government can't borrow, what's going to happen is you're going to have to wait longer and longer for your money. Now, one of the things that the government can do is prioritize certain payments, and what will happen then, in my view, is it's likely to avoid these problems about the Constitution. They'll prioritize the interest payments and the debt payments, so there won't be a default. It's a relatively small part of the budget, especially compared to the taxes, so there's no need for a default. And what will happen is various other things will be prioritized, so it's very difficult to believe the military won't get paid. And I believe one of the votes last night was to pay active duty military. And there'll probably be some other exceptions. They can pay Social Security out of the trust funds, so that won't get unpaid. So what would happen is that we'd have these steadily lengthening bills that the government doesn't pay. You know that you're going to get paid at some point, and when the two sides come together, then they'll pay off everything, presumably. So there won't be default, it's just there'll be lags. Now, that may or may not happen. If you ask the Treasury, somebody asks the Treasury, what are you going to do? Are you going to prioritize the debt? And they say, no, we can't do that. It wouldn't be fair. But actually, one of the passages which is very interesting in the book is that what they said is, well, indeed, that's exactly what the politicians will say before the event. They'll say it's very difficult, we can't do this, because they want to try and persuade the other side that it's going to be a catastrophe. So they do it that way. But then, of course, as we get to the closer and closer to the date where we run out of borrowing capacity, it's going to switch exactly the opposite way. And they'll say, don't worry, we're not going to default. Everything's going to be fine in terms of the debt. So we'll see, if there's very strong adverse reaction to what happened last night, then maybe we won't get that. They'll do the deal earlier on. On the other hand, if people say, okay, it's government as usual, then we may get the same confrontation in 2 weeks' time. But this one is a lot more serious, because the issue of a default, if the government did default, it raises all sorts of technical issues which would be extremely difficult to deal with. But as I say, if you want to read about that, download the book, and there are some interesting chapters.